Exodus 32, verse 25 beginning, And when Moses saw that the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked unto their shame among their enemies, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come unto me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. And he said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. The children of Israel had been slaves in Egypt for 215 years. Some people would argue that it was 400 or 430 years, but as we've taught in another video study, there are different specifications given for each of those periods of time. They are not contradictions. God had delivered the children of Israel from their slavery and had miraculously delivered them again from Pharaoh and his army at the Red Sea. Israel was a large group, and based upon numbers given in the Bible, would have been around 2 to 3 million people by that time. Now they had been wandering in the wilderness, and at that moment were waiting in the wilderness where Moses met with God, who was busy writing upon 2 tablets of stone the basic laws Moses was to pass on to Israel. On this day that is described in our opening text, things went badly wrong, and Israel sinned dreadfully and offended God greatly. As a result, we see that 3,000 were killed because of their sins. Those would have been the people who pushed Aaron to make them an idol, and who then danced about and worshipped it. The events which took place in Exodus 32 point to one of the great symbolic pictures that the Bible gives us, which portray very important lessons for us today. We will take each main part of the overall picture presented in this text, and we'll break them down piece by piece. When we're finished, you'll see why very few people in our world realize the special lesson that is being given to us in Exodus 32. Our opening scriptures are actually the middle of the story, but we will look at one of those verses first and then expand into other parts of this chapter in our Bibles. Exodus 32, verse 25, And when Moses saw that the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked unto their shame among their enemies. We have other video studies to demonstrate and prove that even as God created man in his own image and likeness, God did not consider mankind's nakedness an evil thing in itself. If you study our other materials, you'll learn the various details of this subject, but for now, I'll only stress that there are many times spoken of in the Bible where God actually required people to go naked. The shame spoken of in this text that Aaron was trying to create was not due to how much skin was showing. Many religious groups today make very strong rules pertaining to dress because they believe God was concerned about this body part or that body part being seen by someone. Instead, the shame mention, which is explained in other scriptures, was due to the lack of means of keeping certain parts of the body clean back in that day. They didn't have modern means such as we have to clean up when they would rid their bodies of solid waste. As a result, it became a shameful thing to be seen in an unclean state with a bare behind. Again, study our other videos on this site and you'll see various proofs of that taught. Keep in mind that when this incident takes place, Israel was camped out in the wilderness, sandwiched between rugged mountain peaks and with barely enough space to crowd everyone in. They didn't have much in the way of water supply and no facilities for bathrooms of any kind. The people had insisted that Aaron, Moses' brother and assistant leader to some degree, should make them a golden calf, an idol to worship, since Moses had been gone so long and they were tired of waiting for him to come back. We need to remind ourselves as we study this event that everyone in camp had spent their whole lives living in Egypt. Egyptians worshipped various idols they considered to be gods, and among them, a very special god in the eyes of the Egyptians was the bull. Therefore, since the children of Israel had lived under that idolatrous influence all their lives, they were not very familiar with the true God, and had not learned to trust Moses very well either. They quickly tired of waiting to hear from the true God, who Moses was getting truth from in order to present it to them, and they cried out desiring an idol, a pretense god, like they had had in Egypt. In Egypt, the children of Israel were slaves, and if you study any scholarly materials about Egypt, you'll come to learn that Egyptians didn't wear a lot of clothes due to the great heat of their region, and their slaves wore even less. Most of the information we have from ancient times, such as writings and pictures that have been discovered in Egyptian tombs, declare that slaves generally wore nothing. Thus, they were used to that. But in Egypt, they lived in very developed cities, and they did have plenty of water thanks to the Nile River to keep them clean. In this situation of our text, that was no longer their status, and their worry was that should they come across any enemies, it would embarrass them beyond words to be seen naked in an unclean state. For a quick reminder of this often repeated lesson in the Bible, I would like to read a principle given to us in 1 Corinthians 15:42. It says, "So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption." The context of that verse shows us the picture is painted of our human fleshly bodies we now dwell in. Our bodies here in this life are not like our bodies we will have in eternity. Our current bodies feed on corruption, that is, food that will corrupt, or in other words, spoil and rot away and finally return to the dust from whence it came. That's the story of our human bodies as well. And it's the story of the food that feeds our human bodies. Our bodies and our food are all quite mortal, or prone to corruption, to use the biblical term. That entire situation of our fleshly corruptible bodies came to pass due to the sin committed by Adam and Eve in the Garden in Eden. You'll find a much more in-depth study of that truth in our video, The Book of Revelation, Part 4. Previous to the time of the casting out of the garden, Adam and Eve and their descendants had not aged at all. Instead, they began to die, as God had spoken that they would, when they committed sin and had to be cast out of the garden. The corruption that takes place in our bodies now is an illustration of how God sees sin. It was not a case where God just sentenced mankind to death. It was the fact that sin causes death. And that's why we all die, because, as Paul said in Romans 3:23, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The glory of God is sinless perfection, never doing anything wrong. Sin, on the other hand, brings death, and the process that leads to death is corruption, decay, and rotting, which of course begins with the process of aging. In our human lives, God has attempted to remind us every day of the shamefulness of sin. Every day when the solid wastes that accumulate in our bodies are emptied out, God intends for it to remind us of how shameful and stinking that sin really is. He despises it. Most normal people prefer to eliminate the waste from their body in private, and there's good reason for that. Most people prefer to clean themselves up afterwards, and there's good reason for that. Why? Because it's a shameful process. It's a stinky process, and we don't want to continue through our day stinking and messy. We can't help the fact it has to happen, but we don't like to be reminded all day that it did happen. Therefore, we clean ourselves up. The same is true with sin in the spiritual realm. God intends that we have that same shame, and lots more in fact, when the filth of sin emerges in our fleshly lives. It puts us in what the Bible calls the dunghill, and a true child of God will feel terribly ashamed of the filth that is all over them from the sin that transpired in their life. People in ancient times didn't have the modern conveniences and means of cleaning up that we have today. Therefore, as we have proved in past video studies, people in ancient times were particularly concerned to cover up their behinds, even as that also was what Adam and Eve were so concerned to cover when they grabbed the fig leaves to do so as soon as they had sinned in the garden by eating the forbidden fruit. That mixture of good and evil, or truth and falsehoods, as the Bible portrays to us. We need to take heed to the fact that the corruption that is so common to us in our human bodies is just an illustration God has given us. The real corruption is what takes place in our hearts. I'm not talking about our major blood valve system that we call our heart. I'm speaking of our spirit, the real us, just as the Bible uses the symbolism and refers to our spirit as our heart. Let's see how Jesus portrayed it. In Matthew 15 and verse 15, "Then answered Peter and said unto him, Declare unto us this parable. And Jesus said, Are ye also yet without understanding? Do not ye yet understand that whatsoever entereth in at the mouth goeth into the belly, and is cast out into the draught?" I want to stress before we read further, the word draught is an ancient term for what today we would refer to as an outhouse. It's speaking of a place we could term an outdoor bathroom or toilet. Reading on where Jesus' words are, "But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashen hands defileth not a man." What Jesus is trying to convey to Peter and to us also is that the physical corruption, such as germs and human waste, is not what defiles us. Sure, human waste makes us ashamed, but it's not going to send anyone to hell. It's not what will send us into a damned eternity. It's the spiritual corruption that arises with immorality and ungodliness that causes people to be truly shameful. But as is typical of most humans, throughout history, people have worried more about their physical appearance than their spiritual appearance in the eyes of God. So when we look back at Exodus 32 and the account of events taking place, we have to keep in mind that the children of Israel were used to being naked. It had not been that many days since they were living that way day by day in Egypt. They had lived that way throughout their lives. The history of ancient Egypt demonstrates that again and again to us. But they had more of a civilization in Egypt. They had conveniences and means of cleaning up. Now they're in the midst of the wilderness of Arabia, and they're without conveniences and without much water or means to clean up. Therefore, their concern became that of what their appearance would be if caught by their enemies, which were the Egyptians who had been chasing after them. They were greatly ashamed of how they would appear to the Egyptians if they were caught while swept up in their idolatrous activities, and doing so stark naked while in an unclean state. Many people fail to realize that even though the Egyptians worshiped false gods, idols, they still tried to present themselves before those false gods in a cleaned up manner, which was called purification. Even in most false religions of ancient times, people tried to do their best to worship their false gods in a state of physical cleanliness. Today's modern false religions many times just try to make their religion easy and handy for people so it doesn't put them out too much and cause them not to attend, and therefore cause those churches to lose the money that would be given. They perceive that as worship services. Israel did not leave Egypt with the robes and such that the religious world today uses in movies and books and TV and etc. to portray Israel as they fled from Egypt. But they did likely manage to come up with some small pieces of fabric for loincloths to cover themselves, especially from behind, to prevent being shamed when seen by their Egyptian enemies who would judge them. Thus we're given an idea of what the camp of people would have been like while this gold calf incident was taking place. They wanted to commit idolatry. Aaron insisted that they commit that idolatry in a naked state, which exposed their uncleanness and their lack of purification. That's why they insisted Aaron make them an idol to worship. Aaron knew that it was wrong, but was fearful of the people. So like so many preachers today, Aaron gave in to their wishes. But he made a deal with them and required them to commit their idolatry without being covered, totally naked. It turned out the idolatrous Israelites were dancing about naked and around their idol when Moses returned from getting the tablets of stone, the 10 Commandments from God. So we now have a good start at seeing the picture concerning the event taking place with ancient Israel. Now we need to go back to the beginning of the story to find out what other details are important for us to understand so we can learn this scripture's spiritual meaning. In Exodus chapter 32, reading from verse 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. The first question that pops into the mind of a lot of people who are not very familiar with the Bible is, if Israel were really slaves in Egypt, as the Bible tells us, then where did they get the money to buy gold jewelry? The answer is found in Exodus 11 and verse 2, as this is the message God gave unto Moses to give to the people of Israel before God led them out of the land of Egypt. Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow of his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver and jewels of gold. Quite likely, some of the gold that was borrowed was kept hidden away in case Israel should be accosted by gangs of bandits while they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. However, it's obvious from the text that some of the gold jewelry was worn. Aaron commanded them to break off their earrings and bring them to him. He had to obtain the material to make the golden calf from that which they wore for ornamentation of their flesh. Exodus chapter 32 and verse 4, and he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So Aaron, the assistant of Moses, gave in to the people's demands. And once the people supplied the gold for raw material, Aaron went right to work fashioning the golden calf, just as Israel had been taught to worship in Egypt. We need to consider for a moment the material that Aaron asked for and used. Gold. What does gold represent in a spiritual sense? To get a little bit of help in that direction, we want to turn to Revelation chapter 3 and begin reading at verse 17. This is Jesus speaking. Because thou sayest, I am rich, and increase with goods, and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched, and miserable, and poor, and blind, and naked, I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, and that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve, that thou mayest see. The Bible teaches again and again that people who are lost are spiritually blind, and also their fleshly corruption is constantly on display in their lives because they are spiritually naked and do not have Jesus Christ's righteousness to cover them when God looks upon them. It's important that we understand that the symbolism of nakedness, as used in the Bible, is in connection with some form of shame that can be exposed via the nakedness. Jesus said in the text we just read in verse 18 that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear. It doesn't take much sense for us to realize that very few people in our world cover every inch of their bodies. Thus, some parts of the body are naked most of the time. And I'm speaking about most of the people in our world. We also should understand that if God is offended by certain parts of the body being naked, then it's very strange that He never gave laws to help us to understand what parts we must cover up. He covered lots of other things in great detail. So if that's such an important matter, then He would have given us information and understanding on that subject. The real key is that Revelation 3 and verse 18 seems to stress there is a shame that can be manifested or seen when someone is naked. And that was spoken back in ancient times, where, as we said, they didn't have the means of cleanliness that we have in most countries today in our world. But yet God is not saying that exposing our bodies in general, which were made by God Himself to look like Himself, is such a terrible sin. It definitely has to do with something else, because again and again in the Bible, God causes even His own people to manifest themselves at times in the nude. Therefore, we need to ask you to think about something, and here is that question. Nakedness simply refers to body parts that are exposed. The Bible does give a lot of keys to help us understand why people were ashamed of being naked. However, the Bible does not speak straightforwardly about what body part or parts bring shame when one is naked. For that reason, we have some people in our world who believe, for example, that women in public must cover themselves completely, all but their eyes. So where do we draw the line? Is it evil to see people's nose or mouth or ears? What about arms and elbows? Or such parts as shoulders and neck, or other parts of the body? There was a time when even here in the United States, women were considered lewd if they allowed their ankles to be seen. Now, bare knees are common, but do bare knees expose one's shame? Many people today assume the sexual organs are what the Bible is speaking of as shameful, but the Bible never states that. Many people also categorize female breasts in that same category, which were created by God as feeding devices for babies. How can those be shameful? Men's breasts are not considered shameful. So why does the public react so negatively towards women who nurse their babies in public, even when they are covered with a blanket? Our modern world has become totally unlike most any phase of ancient times. Let's face facts. There's only one body part that the Bible speaks of as causing shame for people. It doesn't just state the matter bluntly in a few words, but the teaching can be found again and again through the Scriptures. Even the translators in the past have tried to make the subject less repulsive by somewhat veiling that subject. However, that is an evil thing in itself because, as we have said, the Bible uses human excrement as a picture of corruption, a picture of how God views that which is mostly worthless or even sin. As we have stressed already, ancient peoples often didn't have the means of cleanliness in the daily process of eliminating body waste. Therefore, if they were unclean, it was a shame to them. Even most pagan religions in ancient times have requirements for purification. So most people were concerned about that, even many, many thousands of years ago. Notice these verses of Scripture in 2 Samuel 10. Verse 4, Wherefore Hanan took David's servants and shaved off the one half of their beards, and cut off their garments in the middle, even to their buttocks, and sent them away. Verse 5, When they told it unto David, he sent to meet them, because the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, Tarry at Jericho until your beards be grown, and then return. Notice the emphasis does not state that their sexual organs were exposed. It was their bare buttocks that caused them shame. It was so serious that King David sent messengers to meet them. It's easy to understand why if you give thought to all that transpired. Obviously, David sent them replacement loincloths. Then he also gave them orders to not go back out to battle until their beards would grow out. Both things, the shaving of their beards, and even more so the exposing of their behinds, caused them great shame. So much so that David didn't expect them to return home with the shame of their bare buttocks. That's why he sent the messengers out to them. If we are true Christians, we despise the thought of having the spiritual dung or corruption of sin visible in our lives. We hate it. It's so shameful to live in mortal bodies that are capable of unintentionally failing our precious Lord and our God. But we're blessed, however, by Jesus' wonderful words of redemption and help when he speaks of us buying from him gold tried in the fire. That statement, of course, pictures purified gold with the impurities and bad material removed. Let's read Revelation 3:18 one more time, as it contains a very important lesson for us. I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, and that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve, that thou mayest see. That verse speaks of Jesus wanting to sell us something. I can just hear people hollering, salvation is free. Actually, salvation is free because you and I have nothing of real value to buy it with. But our Lord is gracious in that if we will give up our own fleshly lives and our fleshly form of living and instead serve him and focus our lives upon him, then that is how we buy the wondrous gifts that he offers to us in salvation. First, purified gold that is true and genuine riches and is eternal. He's speaking of what literal gold symbolizes. Secondly, white raiment, which of course is spiritual also in nature, just like the gold. It will prevent our shame of our spiritual nakedness from being seen in a spiritual manner. And that's a reference to sin, sins of ignorance in our lives. It will cover for that sin. Thirdly, he says we need our eyes anointed with eye salve that will enable us to truly see spiritually. Again, he's not just speaking to physically blind people. Most of the people whom he is referring to are not physically blind at all. He's wanting to give us spiritual vision, spiritual understanding. This entire passage is an offer of redemption in Jesus Christ, providing for us spiritual things and eternal salvation. Look at how Paul viewed such salvation. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 8, Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. If you will give thought to Jesus' words concerning buying from him gold tried in the fire, and then pay close attention to Paul's testimony here in Philippians, you will understand the keys to this whole symbolic picture in Exodus 32. Paul says here that he counts or imputes all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Jesus Christ. He said he counts all things that he has lost or given up for Christ as dung. They are worthless and corruptible compared to Jesus' eternal value. Paul is therefore saying in a sense that he took Jesus up on buying that gold purified in the fire, the spiritual eternal gold of genuine faith and salvation. Okay, before we wind up this study, we need to see how the things we have been covering enable us to understand a symbolic picture that is presented in our text in Exodus 32 that most people reading the Bible fail to see. We've seen the people's influences upon Aaron to help them return to their pagan ways that they had lived under in Egypt. You might wonder, why would Aaron give in so easily to such evil? Just remember, Moses was not raised with Aaron. Moses was raised in the household of Pharaoh. But God appeared to him at age 40 and let him know what he would be called to do for God's sake. Moses then spent the next 40 years until he was 80 years old, unlearning what he had picked up in Pharaoh's household during that first 40 years. Aaron was also up in years at this time of the event in Exodus 32, but he had not experienced the teachings from God that Moses had received. He was still a pagan worshiper by nature at that point in time. Things were getting worse and worse in the camp of Israel, so God let Moses know about that in Exodus 32. Verse 7, And the Lord said unto Moses, Go, get thee down, for thy people which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. Moses begged God and even got rather strong on the bold side and told God how the Egyptians and other people of the land would view the matter if God destroyed all of Israel. Therefore God changed his mind, and Moses and Joshua headed back to camp. Verse 15, And Moses turned and went down from the mount, and the 2 tables of the testimony were in his hand. The tables were written on both their sides, on the one side and on the other were they written. And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, graven upon the tables. As we see in the text, Moses was carrying the 10 Commandments, written by the very hand of God upon the 2 stones on both sides. Israel was breaking the first 2 commandments severely, right while God was giving those unto Moses. We continue reading in Exodus 32 and verse 19, And it came to pass, as soon as he came nigh unto the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hands and brake them beneath the mount. Now, if we let our minds envision the scene, Moses had good reason to be angry. Keep in mind, though, in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, we are told the following words, Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. So we see then that Moses was a meek man, but the tremendous ungodliness of Israel caused him to get very angry for a short time, even to the point that he broke what God had created for him to take to Israel, the tables of stone. Then we see something very strange, and it's important that we look closely so we don't misjudge the matter. Verse 20, And he took the calf which they had made, and burned it in the fire, and ground it to powder, and strawed it upon the water, and made the children of Israel drink of it. Notice now, early in this study in Revelation 3, we see Jesus said, Buy of me gold tried in the fire. So Moses is first purifying this gold. Strange indeed. He was just extremely angry at Israel moments before, but now very quickly he begins to get to the heart of the matter and to deal with the golden calf by first purifying it. The next step, he grinds it to extremely fine powder. Many people find it hard to believe he could do that back in that day, but they had stones which they used to grind their food. Gold is a relatively soft element, so if it were to be ground for a length of time and in a proper manner, it could be rendered to fine powder. I'm sure that Moses knew how to do that based on wisdom that he had gained growing up and being educated in Pharaoh's household. The next step, Moses appears to be producing colloidal gold. He straws it upon the water. To understand that statement I just made, we must keep in mind that what Moses was doing was under God's direction. God is very aware then of the fact that when you reduce gold to fine enough powder and mix it with water, it becomes a very red-colored liquid, colloidal gold. That gives us then a tremendous reminder of a wondrous truth. Moses is giving Israel what symbolizes the very words Jesus spoke in Revelation 3. Moses is in type, or in other words, in allegorical form, giving Israel a representation of Jesus' blood to drink, to recover them before they have to be slain for their sin. However, as in the case of all large groups of people throughout history, not everyone is going to have genuine faith to be cleansed of their ungodliness. Not everyone is going to take part. Thus Moses inquires of Aaron concerning what has transpired before Moses arrived. In verse 21, "And Moses said unto Aaron, What did this people unto thee, that thou hast brought so great a sin upon them? And Aaron said, Let not the anger of my Lord wax hot. Thou knowest the people, that they are set on mischief. For they said unto me, Make us gods, which shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man that brought us out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And I said unto them, Whosoever hath any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it me, then I cast it into the fire, and there came out this calf. And when Moses saw that the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked unto their shame among their enemies, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come unto me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him, and he said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from the gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. For Moses had said, Consecrate yourselves today to the Lord, even every man upon his son and upon his brother, that he may bestow upon you a blessing this day. And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses said unto the people, Ye have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up unto the Lord, peradventure I shall make an atonement for your sin. And Moses returned unto the Lord and said, Oh, this people have sinned a great sin, and have made them gods of gold. Yet now if thou wilt forgive their sin, and if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book which thou hast written. And the Lord said unto Moses, Whosoever hath sinned against me, him will I blot out of my book. Therefore now go, lead the people unto the place of which I have spoken unto thee. Behold, mine angels shall go before thee. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. And the Lord plagued the people, because they made the calf which Aaron made. It's important for us to realize then that the problem which arose among the people of Israel was not as simple as it might appear. Whenever you have a large group of people, ungodly activities, such as we see taking place in Exodus 32, never come to pass by a universal agreement among all the people. Such problems always arise by a few people influencing others, and then that expands and reaches out to even more people and continues on until many are involved. As Paul the Apostle said, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. Sadly, even though Moses was able to bring gold tried in the fire to many of the people of Israel, 3,000 of them had to die because of their part in the whole matter, the ungodliness that transpired. It always works that way when the devil can get a few people to go his way, and then he continues to use them to destroy more and more. May God help us to always remember this lesson from ancient Israel, that we might watch out for the wiles of the devil and stay away from his influences and the damage and destruction that he can bring.